At its peak, this church didn't just promise salvation, it promised success, certainty, and a future that always trended upward. On any given weekend, the building felt less like a sanctuary and more like an arrival terminal. Cars poured in from every direction. Families moved with purpose. Volunteers smiled with practiced warmth. Inside, thousands took their seats, not quietly but expectantly, as if something transformative was about to happen. And for many, it felt like it did. What stood in Houston wasn't just a place of worship. It was an institution engineered for scale. A former professional sports arena, once built for roaring crowds and championship dreams, had been reborn into something far larger than a church. It was a production, a system, a promise made concrete in steel, lights, and screens. The transformation alone told the story. Over $100 million poured into renovations that reshaped the building from top to bottom. Entire floors were added. Offices, classrooms, broadcast facilities, and control rooms filled the structure. Every hallway had a function. Every room served the mission. The main hall, with nearly 17,000 seats, resembled a concert venue more than a cathedral. Two massive screens flanked the stage. Lighting rigs could shift the emotional temperature of the room in seconds. Cameras moved silently, capturing every angle. Nothing here was accidental. This scale wasn't excess, it was essential. Full seats weren't just encouraged, they were required. Energy wasn't a side effect, it was the fuel. The atmosphere had to feel alive, affirming, and unstoppable. That feeling was the product being delivered, and the delivery worked. Each weekend, tens of thousands attended in person. Millions more tuned in across television networks and digital platforms. The sermons crossed borders effortlessly, translated and rebroadcast to audiences far beyond Houston. The message was simple, repeatable, and emotionally resonant. You were meant to feel better when you left than when you arrived. Behind the scenes, the organization functioned like a mid-sized corporation. Hundreds of employees handled logistics, media, scheduling, outreach, and administration. From worship planning to camera crews, from translators to digital editors, every role fed the same machine. The operation ran continuously, week after week, year after year. Financially, the numbers were staggering. Annual income hovered near $90 million, drawn largely from donations and book sales. Though the leader publicly declined a church salary, revenue flowed through speaking events, publishing deals, and media contracts. Best-selling books appeared in airports, bookstores, and online rankings worldwide, reinforcing the brand far beyond the pulpit. But money wasn't the foundation. The message was. The sermons avoided heaviness. Judgment rarely appeared. Guilt was softened. Suffering was reframed. Instead, the focus remained firmly on hope, forward motion, and personal breakthrough. Faith was presented as a key. One that unlocked better health, improved finances, stronger relationships, and inner peace. The language was intentional. It was positive without being demanding, encouraging without being confrontational. You didn't leave feeling corrected. You left feeling empowered. That accessibility was the secret weapon. People from different backgrounds, beliefs, and levels of faith could all find something that resonated. The message didn't ask much of you, but it promised a lot in return. And for a time, that exchange felt fair. Critics noticed early. Some argued the teaching skimmed the surface of theology, prioritizing comfort over depth. Others warned that faith built primarily on optimism struggled when reality turned harsh. But those critiques remained mostly external, drowned out by growth metrics and sold-out services. From the inside, the system felt unstoppable. Every packed seat reinforced legitimacy. Every broadcast extended influence. Every successful event validated the model. Growth became proof. Visibility became authority. And the larger the operation grew, the harder it became to question it. Because questioning success feels counterintuitive. When thousands are smiling, when testimonies circulate, when the brand expands globally, doubt looks like negativity. And negativity had no place here. This wasn't just a church people attended. It became a place people identified with. For many, it represented stability in a chaotic world, a predictable rhythm, a familiar voice, a weekly reminder that things were going to work out, that emotional reliance mattered more than doctrine. It created loyalty. And loyalty created resilience, at least on the surface. Yet every system designed for scale carries a hidden weakness. The same mechanics that amplify success also amplify failure. When perception holds everything together, perception is also what can tear it apart. The larger the spotlight, the harsher the glare. The arena required constant energy to feel alive. The message required momentum to feel convincing. The organization required flawless execution to maintain trust. There was little room for hesitation, missteps, or contradiction. Because when you promise abundance, scarcity becomes dangerous. When you promise openness, hesitation becomes suspicious. And when you promise hope, disappointment cuts deeper. For years, those risks stayed theoretical. The machine kept running. The crowds kept coming. The broadcasts kept expanding. From the outside, it looked like permanence. But permanence was an illusion. Every empire built on perception eventually faces a moment it cannot manage. A moment that doesn't respond to lighting cues or careful messaging. A moment that demands action instead of words. That moment was coming. And when it arrived, it wouldn't just test the organization. It would expose the tension between spectacle and substance, between image and responsibility, between promise and reality. The question was never whether cracks existed. It was whether anyone would notice them before the structure was forced to carry weight it wasn't designed to hold. Success hides weakness until pressure makes it visible. By the end of this chapter, the foundation still looks solid. The lights are on, the seats are full, the message is intact. But the story has already shifted because the next challenge wouldn't arrive on a stage. It would arrive in the real world. And the response would change everything. The illusion of permanence lasted until the city itself demanded proof. Houston is no stranger to storms. Heavy rain, rising water, and evacuation warnings are part of its history. But when Hurricane Harvey arrived in late August of 2017, it wasn't just another weather event. It was a slow-moving catastrophe that drowned neighborhoods, displaced families, and overwhelmed emergency systems. Roads vanished beneath water, shelters filled within hours. Thousands searched desperately for safe ground. In moments like this, institutions reveal their true priorities. As floodwaters rose, schools opened their doors. Small churches unlocked sanctuaries without hesitation. Community centers converted gyms into makeshift dormitories. Volunteers arrived with food, blankets, and boats. The response was chaotic, imperfect, but immediate. And then eyes turned toward the largest church in the city, with a massive arena, extensive resources, and a message centered on generosity and hope. Expectations were high. Many assumed its doors would be among the first to open. Instead, they remained closed. At first, the explanation seemed logistical. The building, leadership said, was inaccessible. Safety concerns were cited. Conditions were unclear. But outside, residents began sharing photos. Dry pavement, empty parking lots, clear entrances. The images spread rapidly, contradicting the official narrative. The internet did what it always does in moments of perceived hypocrisy. It amplified outrage. Questions multiplied with each repost. Why would a church built on abundance hesitate during a crisis of need? What was the point of scale if it couldn't be mobilized when it mattered most? The contrast between the message preached weekly and the inaction unfolding publicly felt jarring. For the first time, the carefully maintained image began to fracture. News outlets picked up the story. Reporters verified the conditions. The arena was dry. The surrounding area passable. The narrative hardened quickly. A church that promised hope appeared absent when its city was drowning. 2 days later, the decision reversed. The doors opened. The building became a shelter. Partnerships were announced. Relief efforts followed. But timing matters in crisis, and the delay had already written the headline. Damage doesn't always come from what you do. Sometimes it comes from when you do it. The fallout wasn't limited to social media criticism. Internally, staff and volunteers were shaken. Many had joined the organization because they believed in its mission. They had internalized the message of service and compassion. Watching the response unfold left them conflicted. Was the priority safety or reputation? Was caution guiding decisions or fear of liability and optics? Those questions lingered in hallways and private conversations long after the floodwaters receded. For the public, the moment crystallized a suspicion that had quietly existed for years, that the institution functioned brilliantly as a brand, but less convincingly as a refuge. That the machinery built to inspire might struggle when inspiration needed to become action. Critics seized the opportunity. Commentators contrasted the church's wealth with its hesitation. Images of luxury homes and best-selling books resurfaced. The gap between prosperity messaging and crisis response became the focal point of national debate. Late-night hosts joked, editorials questioned moral leadership. The story escaped the local bubble and went global. Trust once shaken doesn't return easily. What made the incident particularly damaging wasn't just the delay, it was the symbolism. This wasn't a private failure. It unfolded publicly, in real time, with visual evidence and emotional stakes. It forced a reckoning between narrative and reality. Inside the organization, leadership attempted to regain control of the message. Statements emphasized charitable giving, long-term outreach, and logistical challenges. But explanations felt reactive rather than reassuring. The narrative had already moved beyond clarification. The storm had done more than flood streets. It had exposed a vulnerability in the church's foundation, a system optimized for presentation struggles when unpredictability enters the frame. Carefully scheduled services, rehearsed messaging, and controlled environments don't translate cleanly to emergencies. Crisis demands decisiveness, not polish. The arena, designed to host thousands comfortably, suddenly felt symbolic of excess rather than readiness. Its size, once a point of pride, became part of the critique. Why build so large if you can't respond faster than smaller institutions? For many followers, the disappointment was personal. This wasn't an abstract debate about theology. It was about expectation. They had believed the message wasn't just uplifting, but actionable. That belief had shaped loyalty and trust. Some stayed, others quietly drifted away. What remained was a lingering doubt. If the institution faltered here, where else might it fall short? The leadership understood the stakes. From that point forward, every decision carried added scrutiny. Every statement was parsed. Every future crisis would be measured against this moment. The floodwaters eventually drained. Streets reopened. Life resumed its rhythm. But reputational damage doesn't recede like water. It seeps into perception, altering how every future action is interpreted. More importantly, the event triggered a deeper internal tension. The church had built its success on optimism, control, and momentum. Harvey introduced something those tools couldn't easily manage: moral expectation under pressure. The question was no longer about growth. It was about credibility. And once credibility becomes part of the conversation, spectacle loses its protective power. This wasn't the collapse, not yet. Attendance remained strong, broadcasts continued, books sold. On the surface, the machine still ran, but something fundamental had shifted. The storm forced the organization to confront an uncomfortable truth. Image can inspire, but it can also constrain. When maintaining perception becomes the priority, action becomes risky. And when action is delayed, meaning erodes. The response to Hurricane Harvey didn't end the institution. It changed it. It marked the first time the public narrative turned from admiration to skepticism, from growth to accountability, from celebration to interrogation. And once those questions enter the public consciousness, they rarely leave quietly. The church had passed its first major test, but it hadn't emerged unchanged. What came next would build on this fracture, layer by layer, until the pressure became impossible to ignore. Because storms don't only arrive from the sky. Sometimes they come from within. Long before the storm waters rose, a quieter debate had been building beneath the surface. It wasn't about buildings, budgets, or broadcasts. It was about words. For years, the sermons followed a familiar rhythm. They opened with warmth, moved quickly to encouragement, and closed with reassurance. The language was optimistic, accessible, and carefully calibrated to uplift. Listeners were reminded that setbacks were temporary, that faith unlocked favor, and that better days were always ahead. For millions, that message felt like oxygen. But for others, it raised uncomfortable questions. As the church grew larger and more influential, theologians and pastors from across the Christian spectrum began examining its teachings more closely. Their concern wasn't popularity, it was substance. They argued that something essential was missing. Topics traditionally central to Christian teaching, sin, repentance, suffering, sacrifice, rarely took center stage. Instead, sermons emphasized personal fulfillment, positive thinking, and measurable success. Faith was framed less as a call to transformation and more as a tool for improvement. To supporters, this approach felt refreshing. It removed shame. It welcomed people who felt alienated by harsher doctrines. It made belief approachable in a modern world. To critics, it felt hollow. They warned that removing tension from faith also removed depth, that avoiding difficult truths might keep audiences comfortable, but it left them unprepared for hardship. A belief system built primarily on optimism, they argued, struggles when life delivers pain without explanation. These critiques were not fringe voices. They came from respected leaders within the broader Christian community. Some labeled the teachings misleading. Others accused the church of promoting a transactional view of faith. Believe correctly, and good outcomes will follow. Inside the organization, these criticisms were rarely addressed directly. The leadership maintained a deliberate distance from theological controversy. Interviews avoided specifics. Questions about doctrine were met with broad, inclusive language. Unity was emphasized. Division was avoided. That strategy had worked for years. But as public scrutiny increased after Hurricane Harvey, the theological debate gained new relevance. Critics now connected message to action. They argued that a faith focused on personal blessing struggled to mobilize collective sacrifice. The message wasn't just under academic review anymore. It was being tested against reality. Internally, the tension became harder to ignore. Some staff members began questioning whether the emphasis on consistency had replaced genuine pastoral care. Repetition, once a strength, started to feel limiting. The same phrases, the same themes, delivered week after week, left little room for addressing complex emotional or spiritual struggles. Congregants noticed as well. Longtime attendees spoke quietly about sermons feeling predictable, comforting, yes, but increasingly familiar. In moments of personal loss, illness, or uncertainty, some felt the message didn't fully meet them where they were. Encouragement alone, they discovered, wasn't always enough. The church's massive scale amplified the issue. With tens of thousands attending each weekend and millions watching remotely, the message had to remain universally palatable. Specificity risked alienation, depth risked discomfort, and discomfort threatened momentum, so the tone stayed light. That choice protected growth, but it also narrowed the emotional range of the sermons. Complex questions about suffering, doubt, and injustice remained largely unexplored. The faith presented was aspirational but carefully insulated from contradiction. Critics argued this insulation created fragility. They pointed out that when belief is framed primarily as a pathway to success, failure feels like personal fault. When hardship arrives, followers may question not just circumstances, but their own faith. These concerns grew louder as the cultural climate shifted. Economic uncertainty, political polarization, and global crises challenged simplistic narratives of progress. Audiences everywhere began asking harder questions. The church, however, stayed its course. Leadership believed consistency was strength, that clarity of brand prevented confusion, that people came for hope, not complexity. And they were right, until hope alone stopped satisfying. Public interviews reflected this careful balance. When pressed on theological distinctions, the responses returned to encouragement. The emphasis remained on shared values rather than doctrinal clarity. Inclusivity was prioritized over definition. To some, this felt compassionate. To others, evasive. The debate revealed a deeper issue. The institution had grown so large that it could no longer easily evolve. Adjusting the message risked destabilizing the system. Any significant shift could ripple through broadcasts, books, partnerships, and audience expectations. Change became dangerous. As a result, criticism accumulated without meaningful engagement. Instead of confrontation, there was silence. Instead of dialogue, there was distance. That silence carried consequences. By avoiding controversy, the church also avoided accountability. Questions lingered unanswered. Concerns remained unresolved, and over time, unresolved tension hardens into skepticism. Followers didn't necessarily reject the message outright. Many still found comfort in it. But trust subtly shifted. The sermons inspired, but they no longer convinced everyone. This wasn't a sudden rupture, it was a slow erosion. Attendance numbers remained high, but enthusiasm softened. Applause continued, but energy felt more restrained. The experience still uplifted, but it no longer surprised. The institution had mastered consistency at the cost of adaptability. And then the world changed again. As cultural conversations intensified around authenticity, transparency, and accountability, institutions built on Polish faced new expectations. Audiences wanted more than positivity. They wanted honesty, complexity, acknowledgement of struggle. The church's message, once perfectly tuned for mass appeal, began to feel slightly out of sync. It wasn't wrong, it was incomplete. And incompleteness becomes more visible under pressure. By the end of this chapter, the fault line is clear. The organization had built a message designed to inspire millions, but not necessarily to carry them through crisis. That distinction mattered more than ever as new challenges approached. The question looming wasn't whether the message had helped people. It was whether it could hold them when optimism wasn't enough. And the next test would make that question unavoidable. The next shock didn't arrive with wind or water. It arrived with silence. In March of 2020, doors closed across the world. Stadiums emptied, schools shut down. Streets that once carried constant movement fell still. For institutions built around gathering, the impact was immediate and disorienting. For a church whose identity depended on packed seats and shared energy, it was existential. For the first time in decades, the arena stood empty on a Sunday. There were no volunteers greeting families, no ushers guiding people to their seats, no hum of anticipation before the opening music. The building remained intact, the lights functional, the cameras ready, but the crowd was gone. And that absence changed everything. At first, the transition to online services appeared smooth. High-definition cameras rolled, music swelled, sermons streamed across screens worldwide. From a technical standpoint, the production remained flawless. In some ways, it even improved. Editing tightened, angles sharpened, the experience looked polished. But something essential was missing. Without the crowd, the message felt different. Words that once landed amid cheers and applause now echoed in quiet living rooms. The familiar cadence remained, but the emotional feedback loop was broken. There was no collective response to amplify belief. What had once felt electric now felt thin. For years, the church had relied on momentum. The energy of thousands reinforced conviction. When one person felt uncertain, the crowd carried them forward. Faith was communal, contagious, and reinforced by proximity. Online, that reinforcement vanished. Viewers watching alone began noticing patterns they hadn't before. The repetition stood out. The phrasing felt familiar. The promises sounded identical week after week. Without the emotional surge of a live audience, the message felt more scripted. This wasn't a collapse. It was exposure. Attendance had already been slowly declining before the pandemic. Fewer people were showing up in person year after year, though the numbers were still large enough to appear healthy. COVID accelerated that trend dramatically. Once people adjusted to watching from home, many never returned. Convenience replaced commitment. For some, the shift was practical. Health concerns lingered, schedules changed, habits broke. For others, the distance created space for reflection. Without the immersive environment, they asked questions they hadn't considered before. Why did the sermons feel interchangeable? Why did the message always circle back to the same assurances? Why did deeper struggles feel unaddressed? Financial pressure followed quickly. Donations dropped as attendance fell. Large-scale operations are expensive even when buildings are empty. Staff salaries, maintenance costs, media production, and infrastructure continued regardless of crowd size. To stabilize operations, leadership applied for emergency financial relief intended to help organizations retain employees during shutdowns. When the news became public, backlash followed. Critics questioned why an institution with tens of millions in annual revenue needed government assistance. Supporters defended the decision, pointing to payroll obligations and economic uncertainty. Eventually, the funds were returned, but the damage to public perception lingered. The optics were unavoidable. The pandemic did more than disrupt schedules. It disrupted trust. Internally, anxiety spread. Employees worried about job security. Volunteers wondered about the future. Leadership faced pressure from multiple directions: financial, reputational, and spiritual. The systems built to manage growth were now forced to manage contraction, and contraction is far more difficult. The absence of physical gatherings revealed how much the organization depended on atmosphere. Music still played, but without a crowd, it felt performative. Sermons continued, but without response, they felt one-sided. Faith, once communal, became solitary. For many viewers, that solitude was clarifying. They realized how much their belief experience had been shaped by environment rather than content. The arena, the lights, the collective emotion, these elements had carried them. Without them, the message alone had to stand, and for some, it didn't. Critics seized the moment. They argued the pandemic exposed the fragility of megachurch models built on scale and spectacle. Smaller congregations, they noted, often adapted more fluidly. Local relationships mattered more than production value. The church's global reach, once its greatest strength, now became a limitation. Speaking to millions required generalization. Addressing specific fears required intimacy. Intimacy doesn't scale easily. Leadership attempted to recalibrate. Messaging emphasized resilience, patience, and faith during uncertainty, but the underlying structure remained unchanged. The same delivery, the same themes, the same tone. Consistency, once reassuring, began to feel disconnected. The longer the shutdowns lasted, the clearer the shift became. Online views plateaued, engagement softened, enthusiasm waned. The digital audience remained large, but passive. Watching is not the same as belonging. When physical services eventually resumed, the seats didn't fill as before. Some people returned cautiously, others never came back. The arena, once overflowing, now carried visible gaps. Those empty seats told a story no sermon could erase. The church wasn't collapsing, but it was shrinking, and shrinkage forced uncomfortable questions. Was the institution built for endurance or only expansion? Could it function meaningfully without constant growth? The pandemic stripped away illusion. It revealed what had always been true but rarely acknowledged. The organization was designed to thrive under ideal conditions. Full crowds, positive momentum, controlled environments. Crisis disrupted all three. Faith communities often grow strongest under pressure, but only when their foundations are flexible. Here, flexibility had been sacrificed for consistency, and consistency struggled to respond to unprecedented change. As weeks turned into months, leadership faced a dilemma: adapt and risk alienating loyal supporters, or maintain the formula and accept gradual decline. They chose stability. From the outside, the choice looked calm. From the inside, it felt like inertia. By the time the world began reopening, the damage was done. Habits had shifted. Expectations had changed. Audiences everywhere were reassessing institutions they once trusted without question. The pandemic didn't create skepticism. It revealed it. And for a church built on optimism and certainty, that revelation marked a turning point. The crowd might return partially. The broadcasts might continue. The brand might endure. But the unquestioned momentum was gone. What followed next would prove even harder to contain, because the next shock wouldn't be external. It would come from inside the walls. The first warning didn't come as an announcement. It came as a discovery. Late one evening, during a routine maintenance inside the massive building, a worker removed a section of wall in a rarely visited area. Behind the surface, tucked away from view, was something no one expected to find: bundles of cash, old checks, money that didn't belong there and hadn't for years. The amount was staggering: hundreds of thousands of dollars hidden behind walls, forgotten but not erased. News spread quickly. What might have remained an internal embarrassment became a public spectacle almost overnight. Reports connected the money to a theft reported years earlier, a case that had quietly gone cold. The explanation was simple on paper. The money had been misplaced during renovations. It had slipped through cracks in oversight. No conspiracy, no cover-up. But perception doesn't follow paperwork. For an institution already under scrutiny, the discovery landed like confirmation rather than coincidence. Critics framed it as evidence of mismanagement. Supporters called it an unfortunate anomaly. Leadership emphasized transparency and cooperation. Still, the question lingered: How does that much money disappear inside an organization built on control and precision? The incident didn't exist in isolation. It stacked on top of earlier doubts. Hurricane hesitation, theological criticism, pandemic fallout. Each event alone might have been survivable. Together, they suggested a pattern. Not malice, but fragility. Inside the organization, morale took another hit. Staff members who had endured years of quiet pressure now faced renewed uncertainty. Oversight procedures were reviewed, financial systems were re-examined, meetings multiplied, reassurances circulated. Yet trust, once shaken repeatedly, becomes cautious. Volunteers who once believed the institution ran flawlessly now noticed inconsistencies, small delays, unclear directives, decisions that felt reactive rather than deliberate. The machine still functioned, but it no longer felt seamless. Behind the scenes, leadership faced a growing dilemma. Transparency invited scrutiny. Silence invited suspicion. Every response risked fueling the narrative rather than containing it. And then came a far more sobering reminder of vulnerability. On an ordinary Sunday morning, during a service meant to inspire calm and hope, violence pierced the sense of safety. A woman entered the building carrying a firearm. Security intervened quickly. Lives were saved. But not without cost. In the chaos, a child was gravely injured. The shock rippled instantly. Sirens replaced music. Headlines replaced sermons. What had once been a symbol of openness became a scene of trauma. For a church built on welcome, the incident exposed an impossible tension. Openness invites community. Openness also invites risk. The larger the gathering, the harder absolute safety becomes. Security had been present. Protocols existed, yet scale works against certainty. No plan can account for every variable when tens of thousands move freely through a space designed to feel accessible. The aftermath was heavy. Congregants struggled to process the reality that violence could reach even here. Parents questioned safety. Volunteers questioned procedures. Leadership emphasized strength, resilience, and prayer. But fear doesn't dissolve on command. The incident intensified existing conversations about the cost of scale. Critics argued that mega institutions inherently struggled to balance safety with openness. Supporters insisted the response prevented a greater tragedy. Both were true. What mattered most was how it felt. For years, the church had offered emotional refuge. Now, the refuge itself felt uncertain. The promise of safety, both spiritual and physical, seemed compromised. Attendance dipped again. Some families chose smaller congregations. Others disengaged entirely. The trend wasn't dramatic enough to dominate headlines, but it was consistent enough to worry leadership. The cracks were no longer theoretical. They were operational. Every new challenge exposed another stress point: financial oversight, crisis response, security, messaging. The organization found itself reacting more than leading. This reactive posture marked a turning point. Institutions built for expansion often struggle when forced into defense. Growth hides inefficiency. Momentum masks imbalance. Decline reveals everything. Staff turnover increased quietly. Long-time employees left without public statements. Volunteers scaled back commitments. The emotional labor of maintaining positivity amid uncertainty took its toll. Externally, the narrative hardened. Media coverage shifted tone. Where stories once highlighted success and reach, they now emphasized decline and controversy. Empty seats became visual shorthand for lost influence. Past missteps were revisited with fresh skepticism. The institution wasn't being destroyed, it was being reinterpreted. Once framed as a model of modern faith, it was now examined as a cautionary example of scale without resilience, of inspiration without infrastructure for crisis. Leadership attempted to stabilize the situation through consistency. Services continued. Broadcasts maintained quality. The message remained familiar, but familiarity no longer reassured everyone. Some followers began asking difficult questions. Had they mistaken emotional uplift for spiritual depth? Had they relied on atmosphere instead of conviction? Had loyalty replaced discernment? These questions weren't shouted. They were whispered. And whispers are harder to confront than outrage. By now, the cumulative weight of events had reshaped the institution's identity. It was no longer just a place of hope. It was a place under examination. That examination came from everywhere, from critics outside the faith, from theologians within it, from former supporters, from current attendees struggling with doubt. The leadership faced an impossible challenge. To acknowledge weakness risked undermining authority. To deny it risked losing credibility. So they walked a narrow line. Publicly, confidence remained. Privately, concern deepened. The foundation hadn't collapsed, but it had shifted. And once a foundation moves, everything built upon it feels less secure. What mattered now wasn't whether the church could survive, it was whether it could change. Because the next phase wouldn't be defined by storms, pandemics, or scandals. It would be defined by choice, and the choice would determine whether this institution adapted or slowly faded under the weight of its own contradictions. By this point, the pattern was undeniable. Each crisis arrived differently: a storm, a shutdown, a discovery, an act of violence. None were connected by cause, but all were connected by consequence. Every event added weight to an institution already strained by scale, expectation, and visibility. What had once felt like isolated setbacks now formed a continuous pressure, and pressure forces adaptation or collapse. Inside the organization, leadership faced a reality it could no longer ignore. The old formulas weren't failing outright, but they were no longer sufficient. The systems built to amplify success had proven slow to respond to disruption. The message designed for mass appeal struggled to meet individualized doubt. The structure created for growth resisted recalibration. Adaptation was no longer optional, yet adapting a massive institution is never simple. Every change ripples outward. Adjust messaging too sharply and risk alienating loyal followers. Adjust operations too slowly and risk irrelevance. Even acknowledging the need for change implied vulnerability, something the organization had spent decades avoiding. The tension played out quietly. Behind closed doors, strategic discussions multiplied. Consultants reviewed engagement metrics. Analysts examined attendance trends. Financial teams projected scenarios that no longer assumed endless growth. Questions once considered hypothetical became urgent. What happens if attendance never returns to its peak? What happens if digital audiences shrink instead of expand? What happens if the next generation doesn't inherit loyalty automatically? These questions reshaped priorities. The organization had to decide whether it was a movement or a brand. Movements evolve. Brands protect consistency. For years, the two had appeared aligned. Now they pulled in opposite directions. Staff felt the shift. Longtime employees who had thrived under predictable rhythms now navigated uncertainty. New initiatives appeared, then stalled. Communication became more cautious. Decisions required more approval. The confidence that once guided operations softened into deliberation. This wasn't dysfunction, it was recalibration under stress. Publicly, leadership emphasized endurance. Messages focused on perseverance, patience, and trust. The tone grew slightly more sober, though still hopeful. Acknowledgments of challenge surfaced, carefully phrased to avoid alarm. But subtle changes were noticeable. Services shortened. Language softened further. The message leaned even more heavily into reassurance. Faith was framed as stability amid chaos, rather than a catalyst for transformation. This shift revealed another tension. Reassurance comforts those who stay. It does little to attract those who have already left. The organization found itself preaching increasingly to the converted. Loyal attendees nodded along. Skeptical observers remained unconvinced. The gap widened. Meanwhile, cultural expectations continued to change. Audiences everywhere were demanding transparency from institutions. Scandals across industries had trained the public to question authority. Silence was interpreted as avoidance. Optimism without accountability felt incomplete. The church's instinct to minimize controversy now worked against it. Where earlier generations accepted polished messaging, newer audiences expected candor. They wanted leaders to name uncertainty, not smooth it over. They wanted acknowledgement of failure, not redirection. Adaptation required vulnerability, and vulnerability carried risk. Within leadership circles, debate emerged. Some argued the core message should remain untouched. That consistency was the institution's strength. That deviation would fracture identity. Others believed evolution was necessary for survival, that acknowledging complexity would deepen credibility, that growth in the future required discomfort in the present. Neither side was wrong, but indecision favored inertia. As months passed, incremental adjustments replaced bold change. Pilot programs tested smaller gatherings. Digital engagement strategies were refined. Outreach efforts emphasized community impact more visibly. These efforts helped at the margins, but they didn't address the core challenge. The institution had grown so large that authenticity became difficult to convey. Every statement passed through layers of review. Every message felt calculated. Even sincerity sounded scripted. Trust, once instinctive, now required proof. Congregants sensed the shift. Some appreciated the steadiness. Others felt the distance. The experience remained professional, inspiring, and orderly. It no longer felt intimate. For many, that distinction mattered. Faith, at its core, thrives on connection. Connection weakens when scale dominates. The larger the audience, the harder it becomes to speak to individuals without abstraction. This realization forced another uncomfortable question. Had the institution outgrown its ability to pastor? The answer wasn't simple. Support programs still existed. Counseling services continued. Charitable initiatives operated globally, but perception had shifted. The church felt less like a community and more like a platform. Platforms broadcast, communities listen. Adapting meant choosing which identity to prioritize. Externally, commentary intensified. Analysts compared attendance trends to broader declines in organized religion. Some framed the situation as inevitable. Others argued the church's specific model accelerated disengagement. Leadership resisted fatalism. They believed the institution still had relevance, still had influence, still had purpose. But belief alone couldn't reverse momentum. Adaptation required clarity. Was the goal to preserve what had been built, or to reimagine what could be? Preservation favors stability. Reimagination invites disruption. The organization stood at that crossroads. For decades, growth had been the metric of success. More attendees, more broadcasts, more reach. Now success required different measures, depth instead of breadth, trust instead of visibility, impact instead of optics. Those shifts demanded humility, and humility is difficult for institutions accustomed to certainty. As leadership grappled with these decisions, time continued to apply pressure. Every month of stagnation normalized decline. Every unaddressed concern hardened skepticism, yet collapse was not imminent. The institution remained large, influential, and financially capable. Its voice still reached millions. Its presence still mattered, but the margin for error had narrowed. The next phase wouldn't be defined by external shocks. It would be shaped by internal choices. Choices about transparency, about messaging, about scale, about what kind of institution this would become in a changed world. Adaptation was no longer about survival. It was about relevance. And relevance demands more than reassurance. It demands truth, even when truth unsettles. Whether the organization could embrace that truth would determine not just its future, but its legacy, because institutions don't disappear overnight. They fade slowly, unless they choose to become something new. Institutions rarely collapse in a single moment. They unravel through reflection. By now, the noise had quieted, not because the questions were answered, but because fatigue had set in. The constant cycle of criticism, defense, and recalibration had exhausted both supporters and skeptics. What remained was something more dangerous than outrage: indifference. For decades, the church had been unavoidable. Its size demanded attention. Its reach ensured relevance. Even critics engaged because the influence was undeniable. But as attendance softened and public fascination waned, a different risk emerged: being ignored. That shift altered the conversation entirely. Leadership recognized it, even if few spoke it aloud. Controversy can be managed, decline can be analyzed, but irrelevance erodes quietly, without headlines or urgency. The institution now faced a subtler reckoning. What would remain when the spotlight dimmed? This question extended beyond numbers. Attendance figures and streaming metrics mattered, but they no longer told the full story. The deeper concern was influence. Had the church shaped people in a lasting way, or merely inspired them temporarily? Legacy isn't measured at the peak of success. It's measured when momentum slows. Inside leadership meetings, the conversation increasingly turned reflective, not just strategic, but existential. The organization had achieved what few ever do: global reach, cultural recognition, financial stability. But achievement alone doesn't guarantee meaning. Some leaders argued that legacy was already secured. Millions had been encouraged. Countless lives had been uplifted. The message had helped people through hardship. That impact couldn't be erased by criticism or decline. Others questioned whether encouragement without transformation was enough. Had people been equipped to endure suffering, or only reassured while conditions were favorable? Had faith been deepened, or simply made comfortable? These weren't accusations. They were honest doubts. Longtime members felt them too. For years, loyalty had been instinctive. Attendance was habitual. Trust was assumed. But as the institution changed, so did the relationship. Some members stayed out of gratitude rather than conviction. Others remained because leaving felt like betrayal. Yet younger audiences approached differently. They didn't inherit loyalty. They evaluated institutions based on transparency, authenticity, and alignment with lived experience. They asked questions openly. They expected answers that acknowledged complexity. The church struggled to speak that language. Its messaging remained polished, careful, and optimistic. Those qualities had once drawn millions. Now they risked sounding distant. Younger listeners weren't rejecting hope. They were rejecting avoidance. They wanted leaders who could say, "We don't know," without losing authority, who could acknowledge failure without spinning it, who could hold tension without rushing to resolution. The institution had rarely practiced that posture. Legacy, it became clear, wasn't just about what had been built. It was about what could be passed forward, and that required adaptability across generations. Externally, analysts began framing the church's story as a case study, not of scandal, but of scale, of what happens when spiritual movements adopt corporate structures, of how growth changes priorities, even unintentionally. This framing was uncomfortable but instructive. The church hadn't lost its message. It had lost its mystery. Everything was predictable: the rhythm, the tone, the outcome. For a faith tradition rooted in transcendence, predictability can become limiting. Legacy demands renewal. Renewal requires risk. The organization now faced a choice it had avoided for years: preserve the system that built success, or dismantle parts of it to pursue depth. Both paths carried consequences. Preservation promised stability, but gradual fading. Reinvention promised relevance, but uncertainty. Leadership hesitated, not from fear, but from responsibility. Thousands of staff depended on continuity. Millions of followers expected consistency. Sudden change could fracture trust further, yet gradual decline posed its own danger. Institutions that cling too tightly to past formulas often mistake loyalty for permanence, but loyalty erodes when people feel unheard. The question of legacy forced a reframing. What was the church ultimately for? Was it a place people visited to feel encouraged, or a community that shaped identity? Was it a broadcast reaching millions, or a congregation caring for individuals? Could it be both, or had scale made that impossible? These questions had no easy answers. Publicly, the church continued its work. Services went on. Outreach programs operated. Charitable giving continued. On the surface, life looked normal. But beneath that normalcy, something had changed. The certainty that once defined the institution softened. Leaders spoke less about growth and more about stewardship, less about expansion and more about faithfulness. The language subtly shifted from conquest to care. This shift mattered. It signaled an awareness that the era of effortless influence had passed. The next phase would require intentionality rather than momentum. Legacy isn't built by defending the past. It's built by preparing for a future you don't fully control. For some followers, this realization rekindled hope. They believed the church could evolve, that it could learn from its missteps, that it could model humility at scale. For others, the realization came too late. Their trust had already moved elsewhere. They carried no anger, only distance. Distance is harder to bridge than opposition. As the institution looked ahead, it faced a sobering truth. Even if attendance stabilized, even if finances recovered, the story would never return to what it once was. And that was not necessarily failure. It was transition. Every movement reaches a moment when it must decide whether to fossilize or transform, to protect legacy or redefine it. The church now stood at that moment. Its past achievements were undeniable. Its influence, though diminished, remained significant. Its future, however, was unwritten. Legacy would not be determined by critics or headlines. It would be determined by what the institution chose to value when applause no longer guided decisions, whether it would prioritize comfort or courage, certainty or curiosity, image or integrity. The answers to those questions wouldn't arrive in a sermon. They would be revealed over time through choices both visible and unseen, because legacy is not what you claim. It is what remains when you stop speaking. As the institution recalibrated, attention inevitably narrowed to a single figure. For years, leadership had been synonymous with reassurance. The voice at the center of the organization wasn't known for confrontation or controversy. It was known for calm, for optimism, for delivering certainty in uncertain times. That consistency had built trust, loyalty, and a following that stretched far beyond geography. But in moments of institutional strain, leaders become symbols, and symbols invite projection. Supporters saw steadiness. They believed calm leadership prevented panic, that avoiding reactive decisions preserved unity, that the refusal to engage critics directly reflected confidence rather than avoidance. Critics saw something else. They saw detachment. They interpreted restraint as insulation. They argued that leadership remained untouched by the consequences experienced by staff, volunteers, and congregants navigating uncertainty. Neither perception was entirely fair. Leadership at this scale doesn't resemble personal ministry. It resembles stewardship of a complex system. Decisions ripple outward, affecting thousands of livelihoods and millions of expectations. Caution becomes not just preference, but obligation. Yet symbolism doesn't care about nuance. When an institution faces pressure, people want visible ownership. They want acknowledgement that reaches beyond reassurance. They want to know their concerns are not only heard, but shared. This is where the tension sharpened. The leader's style had always emphasized encouragement over explanation. That approach worked when trust was abundant. Under scrutiny, it felt insufficient to some. Public appearances remained consistent in tone. Messages focused on hope, perseverance, and faith through adversity. Rarely did they dwell on institutional missteps. Rarely did they offer detailed reflection on past controversies. This restraint protected the brand, but it also fueled speculation. In the absence of direct acknowledgement, others filled the space. Commentators analyzed body language. Critics dissected phrasing. Supporters defended intent. Every appearance became a Rorschach test, interpreted through existing belief. Leadership became less about action and more about perception. Internally, this dynamic created strain. Staff members navigating operational challenges wanted clarity. Volunteers fielding questions from friends wanted answers. Congregants wrestling with doubt wanted recognition. The leader's distance, once perceived as strength, now felt ambiguous. Not cold, but remote. This distance wasn't personal, it was structural. As institutions grow, leaders become insulated by layers of management. Access narrows. Communication becomes mediated. Authenticity risks dilution. Yet audiences still expect intimacy. They remember earlier years when the leader felt accessible, relatable, human. They struggle to reconcile that memory with the present reality of scale and security. This gap widened the symbolic weight of leadership. The leader was no longer just a person delivering sermons. They were a representation of the institution's values, priorities, and blind spots. Fair or not, every critique of the organization attached itself to that image. Some followers responded with fierce loyalty. They argued that leadership had remained consistent, compassionate, and focused on faith rather than politics or controversy. They saw criticism as unfair, even malicious. Others disengaged quietly, not in protest, but in disappointment. They didn't demand confrontation. They wanted acknowledgement. They wanted to hear, in plain terms, that complexity existed and mistakes had been made. Silence frustrated them more than failure would have. Leadership, however, faced a dilemma with no clean solution. Addressing every criticism risked legitimizing narratives they believed distorted reality. Remaining silent risked appearing indifferent. There was no script for this moment. The institution had grown beyond traditional frameworks of accountability. It wasn't a small congregation where personal conversations could resolve tension. It was a global platform where every statement traveled instantly and permanently. In that environment, restraint felt safer, yet safety often comes at the cost of connection. This trade-off reshaped how leadership was perceived. The calm tone remained, but it no longer unified all listeners. For some, it reassured. For others, it alienated. Leadership became less about persuasion and more about endurance. The leader continued delivering the same message with the same cadence: hope, faith, forward motion. The formula had not changed, but the audience had. Those who stayed valued familiarity. Those who left cited stagnation. The leader didn't chase either group. That neutrality preserved internal stability, but slowed renewal. Symbols rarely get the benefit of explanation. As the leader remained steady, the institution's challenges continued unfolding. Attendance stabilized at lower levels. Financial pressures persisted but became manageable. Public scrutiny faded into periodic reminders rather than constant attention. From the outside, it appeared the storm had passed. Inside, leadership knew better. The underlying questions remained unanswered. The institution still faced generational shifts. The message still navigated tension between optimism and realism. The structure still balanced scale against intimacy. And the leader remained at the center of it all. Some wondered whether a different leadership style would have altered the trajectory. More transparency, more direct engagement, more vulnerability. Others argued that any deviation would have fractured the institution further. That steadiness prevented chaos. That survival itself validated the approach. History rarely offers immediate verdicts. Leadership legacies are shaped over decades, not headlines. What feels insufficient in one era may appear wise in retrospect. What seems cautious may later be understood as restraint. The true measure of leadership isn't applause during success. It's coherence during decline. By that measure, the institution had not imploded. It had absorbed shock without collapse. That outcome mattered, but coherence alone doesn't guarantee vitality. As time passed, the leader's role shifted subtly. Less architect of growth, more guardian of continuity, less visionary, more stabilizer. This shift was neither failure nor triumph. It was adaptation. Whether that adaptation would sustain relevance remained unclear. The leader continued speaking hope into uncertainty, continued offering reassurance in a skeptical age, continued believing consistency would outlast criticism. That belief would be tested not by crisis but by time, because symbols endure only as long as they resonate. And resonance depends not on perfection, but on presence. Whether leadership could reconnect presence with authority would shape the final chapter of this story, not through a single speech, but through what followed when attention moved elsewhere. Because when the spotlight fades, leadership faces its most honest audience, those who remain. When the spotlight moves on, what remains is rarely dramatic. It is quieter, more honest, less forgiving. For years, attention had shaped the rhythm of the institution. Growth brought momentum. Momentum brought confidence. Even criticism, when loud enough, kept the church at the center of conversation. Being discussed, positively or negatively, still meant being relevant. But eventually, the noise softened. Not because everything was resolved, but because the story no longer felt urgent to outsiders. New controversies claimed attention elsewhere. Cultural focus shifted. The church, once a constant headline, became background. This transition was subtle but profound. Without constant scrutiny, the institution lost a strange kind of fuel. External pressure had forced responses, explanations, and adjustments. In its absence, the organization faced itself. What does faith look like when no one is watching? Attendance stabilized at a lower plateau, not collapsing, not rebounding, settling. Those who remained were no longer casual observers. They were committed. Familiar faces filled familiar seats. The crowd was smaller but more predictable. This stability brought relief. Operations adjusted to the new normal, budgets tightened, staffing recalibrated, programs were streamlined. The organization learned to function without assuming endless expansion. In many ways, it became healthier, but something else changed too. The church was no longer aspirational for the broader culture. It didn't represent the future of modern faith as it once had. It represented an era that had peaked and passed. That realization forced a deeper reckoning. For decades, the message had emphasized personal growth, optimism, and forward motion. Those ideas resonated powerfully in an age of expansion, but in a world marked by uncertainty, loss, and fragmentation, optimism alone felt incomplete. The people who stayed began asking quieter questions. What does faith offer when things don't improve? What does belief mean when success doesn't follow obedience? What holds when the promise of progress stalls? These weren't questions shouted from pulpits or debated on television. They surfaced in small groups, private conversations, and moments of personal reflection. The institution responded cautiously. Messaging acknowledged hardship more directly than before, but still avoided lingering there. Suffering was recognized, but quickly reframed. The tone remained gentle, supportive, and reassuring. For some, that was enough. They didn't want confrontation. They wanted steadiness. In a fractured world, predictability felt like refuge. The church provided that. A familiar voice, a consistent message, a sense of continuity when everything else felt unstable. For others, it wasn't. They wanted faith that wrestled openly with doubt, that allowed unanswered questions to stand without immediate resolution, that treated struggle not as an obstacle to belief, but as part of it. Those seekers often looked elsewhere. Smaller congregations, alternative communities, private spirituality. The shift wasn't dramatic or hostile. It was organic. Faith became decentralized. This decentralization reflected a broader cultural trend. Authority was no longer assumed. Institutions were evaluated continuously. Loyalty was conditional. The church, once confident in its centrality, now operated within this new landscape. It adapted in practical ways. Outreach efforts emphasized local impact rather than global reach. Messaging highlighted service over spectacle. The tone softened further, focusing on care rather than ambition. These changes mattered. They demonstrated learning. Not dramatic transformation, but gradual recalibration. The institution was no longer chasing scale. It was protecting relevance where it still existed. The question of influence remained. The church still reached millions digitally, but reach without engagement is hollow. View counts didn't always translate to commitment. Followers consumed content without identifying deeply with the institution. This passive engagement challenged traditional measures of success. Was influence about numbers or about depth? Was presence enough, or did it require participation? The answers were no longer clear. Leadership faced a quieter but more demanding task. Sustaining meaning without momentum, nurturing faith without spectacle, leading without dominance. This required patience. Institutions accustomed to growth struggle with plateaus. Plateaus force introspection. They demand justification beyond success. In this season, the church discovered both strengths and limitations. Its structure allowed continuity. Its resources supported ongoing outreach. Its message still comforted many. But its scale limited intimacy. Its consistency restricted experimentation. Its caution slowed renewal. These trade-offs define the post-spotlight era. The institution wasn't dying. It was aging. Aging institutions must choose between rigidity and reinvention. Some harden. Others soften. The church leaned toward softening, though cautiously. You could see it in the language. Fewer declarations, more invitations. Less certainty, more encouragement to reflect. This shift, subtle as it was, represented a philosophical change. Faith was no longer framed as a formula for outcomes. It was framed as a companion through uncertainty. That reframing resonated with those who stayed. They weren't there for guarantees. They were there for presence. Yet even presence requires authenticity, and the challenge moving forward wasn't whether the church could continue. It could. The challenge was whether it could speak meaningfully into a world that no longer granted authority by default. Legacy now depended on adaptability, not the flashy kind, the quiet kind, the kind that listens before speaking, that acknowledges limits, that allows space for doubt without rushing to fix it. Whether the institution fully embraced that posture remained unclear, but one thing was certain: the era of defining faith through spectacle had ended. What followed would be smaller, slower, less visible, and potentially more honest. Faith, after the spotlight, doesn't announce itself. It reveals itself over time in the conversations that happen without cameras, in the commitments that persist without applause, in the beliefs that endure without guarantees. The church now existed in that space, not as a symbol of dominance, but as a test of endurance. Whether it would find renewed meaning, there would shape not just its future, but the lessons others would draw from its journey. Because the most important chapters are rarely the loudest. They are the ones written when no one is counting. When the crowds thin and the cameras pull away, what remains is not the building, the brand, or the broadcasts. What remains is impact, quiet, uneven, and difficult to measure. For this church, the final chapter is not one of collapse or redemption, but of reckoning. Because reckoning is what happens when certainty gives way to reflection. The organization still stands. Services continue. The lights still turn on each weekend. The message still reaches millions across screens and speakers. By many metrics, it remains one of the most influential religious institutions of its time. Yet influence no longer feels effortless. The institution now operates in a world that has changed fundamentally from the one that allowed its ascent. Authority is questioned by default. Optimism is filtered through skepticism. Faith is increasingly personal, decentralized, and shaped by lived experience rather than collective spectacle. This environment doesn't destroy large institutions automatically, but it does expose their assumptions. For years, growth was treated as validation. Packed seats signaled relevance. Expanding reach implied divine favor. But growth, as it turns out, is not a permanent state. It is a season. When that season ends, institutions must answer harder questions. What was built beneath the growth? What endures when momentum fades? What did people carry with them when they left? The answers are mixed. For many, the church played a genuine role in their lives. It offered comfort during grief, encouragement during hardship, a sense of belonging during isolation. Those experiences are real, and they matter. No criticism can erase them. For others, the experience felt incomplete. They left feeling inspired but not equipped, encouraged but not anchored. When life turned painful or confusing, the message they had relied on felt insufficient. Both experiences can coexist. Legacy is rarely singular. What complicates this story is not failure, but imbalance. The institution succeeded remarkably at inspiration. It struggled with preparation. It excelled at optimism. It hesitated with complexity. These aren't moral judgments. They are structural realities. The system was designed to lift people up. It was less designed to sit with them when things fell apart. That design choice fueled growth. It also limited resilience. In its current form, the church appears aware of these limitations. Messaging has softened. Language has shifted. There is more acknowledgement of struggle, less insistence on outcomes. The tone is gentler, quieter, less triumphant. This evolution matters. It suggests learning, not dramatic repentance or reinvention, but adjustment. The institution is no longer trying to dominate the conversation. It is trying to remain part of it. Whether that is enough remains uncertain. Faith communities today are judged not by size, but by trust. Trust is built through transparency, consistency, and shared vulnerability. It grows slowly and erodes quickly. The church's greatest challenge moving forward is not attendance, it is credibility. Credibility requires saying hard things when silence would be easier. It requires acknowledging missteps without deflection. It requires prioritizing people over perception, even when doing so complicates the narrative. This is difficult for any institution. It is especially difficult for one built on certainty. Yet uncertainty is the defining condition of the current era. Institutions that refuse to acknowledge it risk irrelevance. Institutions that engage it honestly risk discomfort, but gain depth. The question is whether depth is now valued more than reach. For the church, this question remains open. Leadership continues to emphasize hope. That emphasis is not wrong. Hope remains essential, but hope without honesty becomes fragile. Hope grounded in realism becomes durable. The future will test which version takes root. If the institution continues to prioritize Polish over presence, it will likely persist, but gradually fade from cultural relevance. If it embraces humility, transparency, and limitation, it may shrink, but deepen. Neither outcome is inherently tragic. Not every institution is meant to last forever in its original form. Some exist to serve a moment. Others evolve to serve generations. Still, others leave behind lessons more than structures. This church may ultimately be remembered as a mirror of its time, a period when optimism felt like necessity, when scale promised solutions, when certainty was comforting in a fast-changing world. As that world changed, the limits of that approach became visible, and visibility invites learning. For future leaders, this story offers caution. Growth is not immunity. Influence is not insulation. Messages that inspire must also prepare. For followers, it offers discernment. Emotional uplift is valuable, but faith, if it is to endure, must also make room for doubt, suffering, and unanswered questions. For institutions, it offers humility. You can reach millions and still miss individuals. You can inspire hope and still avoid depth. You can succeed publicly and struggle privately. None of these contradictions negate the good that was done. They contextualize it. What remains now is quieter than what once was. Smaller gatherings, steadier rhythms, less spectacle, less certainty, more ambiguity. That ambiguity is not weakness. It is honesty. Whether the church fully embraces that honesty will determine its final legacy, not in headlines or metrics, but in the lives quietly shaped after the applause has ended. Because in the end, institutions don't live forever, but influence does, if it is grounded in truth rather than image. What remains is not the empire, it is the question it leaves behind. And that question is simple but demanding. Did it teach people how to believe only when things went well, or how to believe when they didn't? The answer will not be found in archives or broadcasts. It will be found in what people carried forward when the doors closed behind them. That is where every legacy is finally written.